Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And go, leave a rating and review. It only takes a few seconds, and it really does help us find new listeners. Just go to the show page on your podcast app and hit 5 stars. Thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included Pete Gregg, Sarah Brule, and Brian Heasley. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Josh Green. Josh is youth director for 24/7 Prayer and Wildfires Festival. Josh traveled the world for years performing and preaching the gospel in various bands. Now, with a burning heart for revival, he continues to fire up young people to be all in for Jesus. Well, Josh and I have a great conversation about what is happening with the youth, hunger for the presence of Jesus, prayer that is persistent, consistent, and resistant, revival that's bubbling up around the world, putting Jesus first and at the center, and living out our faith authentically and consistently. We also hear firsthand from his experience at Asbury. It's fun to hear from somebody who was there and experienced the little revival of what was happening, and to hear about the hunger that was in the room. So enjoy this conversation. I know you're going to get a lot out of it. I wrote down a lot of quotes from this. So here is my conversation with Josh Green. Josh, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
So good to be on from the other side of the pond.
Yeah, it's great. I'd love to hear a little bit of your background, your story of how you became youth director of 24/7 Prayer, and what's really your passion? What has God given you in your hearts that drives you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So started off my Christian life at a place called the Message Trust, which is an evangelism organization heavily linked with Louis Palau and all those guys, doing big proclamation evangelism. I was in one of their bands. So for years, traveling the world, performing in one of their bands, preaching the gospel. And obviously COVID shut that all down for a little bit of time. And I think over that time, I kind of realized or felt like a little bit that I'd become a bit of a professional ministry person. I'd become really good at my ministry to others, but slightly forsaken my ministry before the Lord, which is our primary ministry. And over just the COVID time, God really reawakened me just to himself and his presence. And I rediscovered prayer in a way that I hadn't quite got hold of before. I used to be a person of prayer, but I would kind of flip between it being sort of wholehearted and also at the same time being a bit of a performance and something that I felt like you should do.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite quotes when it comes to prayer is, "It's better to have a heart without words than words without a heart." And that's one of the things that God really challenged me on over COVID was, you're doing all the right activity, but where's your heart? Do you know me? And so I began at the start of 2021 to take, the words in Matthew 7, "Away from me, I never knew you." You've done all these activities, spiritual activities, but do you know me? Took that really seriously and said, I'm going to set myself to know God above everything. And found myself praying 5 or 6 hours a day. And now, before anybody gets intimidated by that, I am the last person in the world that could pray like that. It was a special grace for a special time. And really, it came from a place of desperation and hunger just to experience the Lord for myself in a real way. I had experienced him like that before, but I just wanted that in a fresh way. And so, I was really set myself to do that. And as I was doing that, I started having a picture of little fires all across the UK, and just believing that God was going to call a generation to revival, a young generation revival. Didn't know how that was going to happen. Didn't know how somebody could pay me to bring revival to young people. But I was just praying and praying and praying for that to happen. And about 6 months in, somebody from 24/7 got in touch with me. They got my phone number from somebody else, went down to London, and basically they asked for my story. I shared my story, and they said, we're looking for somebody who wants to bring young people into revival. We'll pay you to do it. And I was like, that's exactly what I want to do. So, I kind of went after that, and the rest has been history. Since the start of 2022, we've been gathering hundreds of young people to pray, seek the Lord, and seeing young people turn to Jesus en masse. And that's a little bit about my journey so far.
That's beautiful. To be able to seek the Lord and get his heart, and to cry out to say, this is really, it is for the glory of God that we want to see revival amongst young people. We want to see them to move forward and to actually have that the cry of your heart. And then somebody calls you and says, hey, I want you to do this and help drive this, to see this a reality and make it a reality. And so as you've started to call young people to pray, have you seen masses of young people praying? What are some of the distinctives? What are the things that you've been seeing out of those times that gives you some hope today? What's going on in the lives of young people that helps them cry out to God?
Authenticity is a big one. The young people these days are longing for something real.
Yeah.
Not that what we had before wasn't real. I believe it certainly was, but I think young people are just desperate for something tangible, something real, which I think sets the bar really high.
Yeah.
Because we can no longer fake it till we make it. We can no longer settle for the status quo. We can no longer give a great performance with the lights and the smoke machines and all that kind of stuff, which, again, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But it comes back to that whole place of the heart. God doesn't look at the outward appearance, but he looks at the heart. The eyes of the Lord range to and fro the earth, looking for a heart to show himself strong through. So I think that what the authenticity initially manifested itself in was the deconstruction movement. Desperation for something real. So let me pull everything apart to find something real and then hopefully build it back up. There wasn't a lot of reconstruction happening, which, a lot of people much smarter than myself, people like John Mark Comer and others, have done some great work on reconstruction and what it means to be spiritually formed. But I think that what it's now turning into is young people simply, purely want Jesus. They want the real thing, the real deal. And if they don't get the real thing, then they're not interested.
Yep.
And it's given us the best and the worst. It means church decline is happening greater than ever before, but also we're seeing things like Asbury break out. And we are now moving to a period of time, particularly in the West, where it's not that we just want revival, we actually need revival. And so that's both daunting but also exciting.
Yeah.
And I think it puts a lot of responsibility on us to call the generation to seek the presence of God, to preach the word of God, uncompromising, unfiltered, and to just set ourselves after the presence of God more than anything else, to go after night and day prayer, 24/7 prayer, to really give ourselves to that more than ever before.
So if you're calling people to revival, one of the things I'd love to just break that down to figure out, when you say revival, what do you mean? What do you say? It's revival.
Yeah, so I'd be looking at passages like 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, turn from their wicked ways, seek my face, then I'll forgive their sin, I'll hear from heaven and heal their land. That is one of those revival passages. That's is two-pronged. It means a spiritual renewal. It means a bringing back to the feet of Jesus, coming back to the cross. But it also, I think it talks about practical community restoration, actually seeing a tangible difference in the here and now. Yeah. It's got to actually, 24/7's 3 core values of prayer, mission, and justice. Yeah. It's got to actually make a difference on the ground. So feeding the poor, setting the captives free, what Jesus spoke about in his commission from Isaiah, that he was here to heal the brokenhearted, to cleanse the lepers. So that is a really important aspect of it. And then you've got things like Joel 2:28, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh.
Yeah.
And we see the outworking of that in Acts, where the gospel is preached, where signs of the Spirit are released, where people get healed. And so that would be quite a loose way that I would understand revival. Is, we kind of say in 24/7, reviving the church, rewiring the culture. And so it's where the church is revived, where the church is renewed, but also the culture begins to change and be rewired.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Pentecost in the early church in Acts 2. Is they're actually breaking bread together. They have fellowship. They're worshiping God. They're praising Him. People are coming to faith. And then it's sad that they also receive favor of the people around them. Like you saw that there was a difference in the community that happened because the Spirit fell. We have people coming to the Lord. We have people being baptized. And the community itself said, wow, what this is happening is what we need. And the community was all for it. And they were excited about it. And then you saw that there was some justice happening, some new things in community happening. One of the things I've been doing recently, I've been teaching some missions history classes, and the history of the Protestant mission movement. Every era has been undergirded by a student movement, and started with prayer, like the Haystack movement, the student volunteer movement, Urbana. Every mission movement, really, students were leading the way, and they, through prayer and crying out to God, they were some of the first to say, send me. I'll go wherever. I'll do whatever you say, Jesus. I'll follow you to the ends of the earth. What are you seeing in some of the stuff that is starting to bubble now, which it's pretty recent, pretty new, but the things that you've started to see a little bubble out, what's going on with the students?
Yeah, I feel like there's sort of a number of different things going on, but if I was to pinpoint it to a few things, I would say there is a great hunger for the presence of God, for something real. We saw that in Asbury. They don't want to leave. They want to stay. But there is one thing that seems to make this generation want to leave, and that is the fact that people don't know about this Jesus that they are so hungry for. And I think we've particularly seen that with things like the Send and circuit riders and, the YWAM guys who are gathering masses of young people to send them out with the Great Commission, Matthew 28, go into the world, preach the gospel, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That seems to be something that this generation are radically on fire for, is spreading the good news of Jesus. And particularly in their sort of way, which is, it's interesting how, you were talking about the student movement. It always seemed to be this like hunger and passion for Jesus, but expressed through their lens, their language. And so these days, that is TikTok, that is Instagram, that is YouTube. And one of the things I was surprised by over the COVID times was you could search on TikTok, pray for, and then it would suggest all these different things that you can find videos for prayer for, anxiety, prayer for struggles with lust, prayer for this. And if you clicked on any of them, there was thousands of videos with millions of views on them where young people are saying, here is a prayer for if you're struggling with depression. Here's a prayer for if you need a financial miracle. All those kind of things. And that was one thing that really surprised me. This generation, as much as they are hungry for the presence of God in more private church meetings, they are desperate to get the message of Jesus out into the public arena. So,
it's good. You've mentioned Asbury a couple times and what we've seen, but you were there on the ground. You went, you saw it, you were able to touch it and sense it. And so, what did you see? What was going on? Give us a glimpse into the room, and what the Spirit was doing in the midst of that.
Yeah, of course, I live in England, so, I heard about it. My wife actually sent me a Facebook post that had gone semi-viral about what was beginning to stir in Asbury. I think she sent that to me 2 days after it happened. It was quite new still. And then it sort of picked up momentum over the weekend, and that week I was getting asked to write a number of articles in the UK for different magazines who wanted to get 24/7's perspective on what we thought was happening, which was, I was honored to do it, but I thought was a little bit strange because I was like, I don't fully know. But what it seems to be is very similar to how the 24/7 movement began, which was a group of students in a prayer room, crying out for a revival. And that's where 24/7 really exploded out of that place. And so I got the opportunity to go with a group of friends who are seeking to see revival come to student campuses in Europe. That's called Revive, headed up by a lady called Sarah Bruel, who is just incredible Brazilian intercessor, fire for the Lord.
Amazing. I've interviewed her on this podcast.
Oh, great.
Good friend of my wife, so I love Sarah.
Oh, so good. Oh, Sarah's amazing. Well, if she's listened to this, then shout out to her. But yeah, so I got the opportunity to go. Didn't have any money, didn't have any contacts out there, but just went by faith, and God provided everything. And really my heart behind going was, ever since I began this role with 24/7, I'm just desperate to see youth-led, young people-led revival, and it's happening. I've got to be there. I've got to see it, even if I can only be in the room for an hour or two. We managed to get unprecedented access in and out the whole time I was there. I was there for about 2.5 days, and I walked up and down the aisles a lot because I wanted to look in the faces of these young people. And I just saw tears. I saw unbroken concentration, which I find to be one of the most powerful things of it. Because, of course, we live in this generation that can't stop scrolling, that can't stop wanting something new, can't keep their attention. But these guys were just fixed, not looking at their phones, not breaking concentration, just transfixed on the worship and the presence of Jesus and what God is doing. And, there were some times where there was an altar call for anybody to stand up to commit their life to Christ, which always there was a response to that, which was people getting saved every few hours, which was amazing. But there wasn't any altar calls for people to come forward at that particular time when the person was speaking. There was just gentle, hey, if you ever want to come forward and receive prayer, just come. And it was like a conveyor belt. There was just constantly young people making their way forward to this old school Wesleyan altar with holiness unto the Lord above the side. And they're just kneeling at this old wooden altar, older people on the other side praying for them, younger people on the other side weeping. Repentance, confession, humility, no celebrities, just Jesus. There was just so many different things going on, but you could feel the hunger in the room. But the thing was, it didn't feel in the room any different from what you would feel, on your average Sunday, where I say average, the presence of God is wonderful. Yeah. But you just, your average Sunday, you're in worship, you can feel the presence of God. It's amazing. Somebody brings a word and that's powerful. It didn't feel any different to that. It was just this simple, gentle move of the Spirit that was just wooing people close to the Lord's heart. And young people just couldn't get it off. They just wanted more and more. And I think if anything, it was the hunger in the room that was driving what was going on. Which that was really refreshing, because I just wonder how our church services and our conferences and different things would go if it was the hunger in the room driving. I've been in ministry for 15 years now, and I felt like a lot of times my role in ministry was to try and generate hunger in the room, try and stir up passion in the room. You did not need to do that there. There was no cheerleading going on. There was no need for any of that. There was enough hunger in the room to drive that thing on for months and months and months, and a real passion in the room to take it home, to come and experience something, but not to stay, but to actually take it back, and people from different tribes and nations and tongues in there. So it was incredible.
That's good. I'd love to figure out then, if you've been, in ministry for 15 years, so you've been trying to drive some of the hunger. How do we start to reorient our gatherings and meetings that it's about all of us, the priesthood of all believers, that the hunger is coming from the room, that celebrities or people on stage aren't trying to drive things, but we're trying to seek Jesus together? What are some postures or ways that we could reorient ourselves so that Jesus is the center and not any one of us, but Jesus is it?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to it. The first one would be that each one of us needs to answer the personal call to be a follower of Jesus, not just to be part of a corporate body, not to outsource our prayer life or our Bible reading to the pastor, but to respond to that personal call to be utterly devoted to Jesus ourselves. And so I think that is incredibly important for each one of us to say, there's no such thing as a gift of prayer. Look it up in the Bible. You won't find that phrase. We are all called to the place of prayer. Paul says, pray without ceasing. I mean, have you ever tried that? Like, the personal call to prayer is really important, because I've preached in rooms where it seems as if there's not much hunger and it can be quite hard. I've also preached in rooms that are full of hungry people, and it's like giving candy to a baby. They are drawing, they are pulling on the word because the hunger level is there, and it's making that decision to say, I'm going to stop looking around at everybody else and waiting for one of my friends to get hungry. I'm going to answer the personal call to get hungry myself. I think there's a particular challenge to men in the church who have for a long time allowed their wives to be the ones who go to the prayer meetings and worship God. Well, it's actually for us men to say, no, I'm going to answer the personal call to be a man of prayer. And yes, I might be in a place where I have to go to work a lot. So in the car on my way to work, I'm going to set myself to be a person of prayer, not just listen to the news or listen to the radio. I'm going to give myself, pray for my kids. But then I think there is the other side of how we hold that corporately as leaders. And I tell a quick story. In my early years, when I first started preaching the gospel, I was preaching the gospel in a very rough part of Manchester, where I'm from in England. And this kid is wearing a Manchester United top. I'm a Manchester City fan, and there's a big rivalry there. And I'll let your podcasters war it out as they're listening. So he's wearing this Manchester United top, and whilst I'm preaching the gospel, he starts swearing at me with his middle finger. But he holds his middle finger up at me the entire time I'm speaking.
Wow.
This is really like on the ground, in the hood, like in the ghetto, like rough kids, and he is angry with me. And basically I got really angry with this kid. Like, he was really getting under my skin. And I'd only been a Christian 3 months, and everybody might cancel me after hearing this story, although I've talked about this story a lot. But to my shame, I basically swore back at this kid whilst speaking. It was awful. And every time I tell this story, people are like, this is so awkward. I've been a Christian 3 months. I barely knew what I was doing. Anyway, I came off the stage. I was utterly convicted. I just was so like, that was the worst thing I could possibly do.
Yeah.
And I was so convicted. I said to the Lord, I'm so sorry. I just want to be somebody who practices what I preach. You know, that old phrase, practice what you preach. And I really clearly heard the Holy Spirit say to me, don't practice what you preach. Preach what you practice. And it just hit me in that moment that for so long, you know, practice what you preach is a reactive statement.
Yeah.
You heard something said by somebody and you know they don't live that out.
Yeah.
So you're saying practice what you preach. So it's reactive, whereas preach what you practice is proactive, because it puts a responsibility on me to say, before I say any word, what is my life saying? How am I living? And so in order to be a proper minister of the Word of God, I have to live out the Word of God. So, for example, if I'm going to preach on prayer, well, do I pray?
Yep.
And it's similar to those words of the Apostle Paul where he says, you know, you've heard it said, don't steal, but do you steal? Was that in the word? I don't know if that was Jesus or Paul, but it's like, do you steal? Do you lie?
Yeah.
And it's like that sense in which it's like, actually, we are in this generation that wants to be very loud with our voice, but we haven't actually gone beyond that and said, how loud is my life? You know, what is my life saying? And I think it was St. Francis of Assisi that said, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words.
Yeah.
And then I love what my friend Ben Jack says. He says, preach the gospel at all times, and because it's necessary, use words. And I like both of those together, because if it was just about me living my life, then it becomes pious, it becomes individualistic, and nobody ever hears the gospel, because Paul says in Romans 10, how would they hear if somebody doesn't preach? So there must be that proclamation of the gospel, but there can't be a proclamation of the gospel if you're not really living the gospel. We can't introduce people to a Jesus that we don't know ourselves. And so I think there is this call for leaders, call for preachers, call for pastors, call for churches, conferences, people in those positions of authority who lead congregations, to make sure that they are living out the word of God before they speak it. You know, you will have heard it a million times. The preacher's up there and he says something challenging and he says, and I'm preaching this to myself as well.
Yeah.
I love the authenticity. I love the humility, but I really hope that that's not fully true. I really hope that you're not saying something and in the moment you're getting convicted of something that you said that you don't actually live. And we've got to this point where we think preaching it is as good as living it. Well, it's not.
Yeah.
We've got to live it first for it to be fully real.
Yeah, and I love that if we go back to the Great Commission in Matthew 28, you know, Jesus said to teach people to obey everything that I've commanded. And so it's not just the words to say, this is what is true, but it is actually obey, to put it into practice, to actually live it out. And so part of what you are saying here is to actually preach what you practice. I think it's part of the way that we could help people to walk with Jesus is that we're saying, hey, I'm doing this. I'm trying to follow Jesus. And as you come along beside me, you can start to learn and practice how to follow Jesus as well and to move forward. And I think if you go back to, you know, the beginning of what you said, that young people right now really want authenticity. If you are preaching and not practicing, they're going to know it. And it's not going to actually hit the same way it used to when we didn't know all these things and we weren't quite aware of people's lives and we were just hearing the words coming out. It's going to hit so different. And so maybe we have to start to reorient, you know, even our gatherings or even the way that we disciple, even the way that we do things, because it's going to have to come out of shared practice and shared trying to figure out what does it look like to follow Jesus together, and not just say, hey, I heard a good sermon on Sunday and now I'm set. So because people are preaching to themselves and they want to practice what they preach. Do you think that is starting to cause some of the decline in church attendance? Or what are some of the things? You're talking a little bit about church attendance is coming down, but you also have this hunger for this authenticity. You have a hunger from young people saying, we want Jesus. Where's the balance between church and church life and church attendance and actually Jesus, following Jesus, and being with him?
Yeah, that's really good. Just to come back to what you were saying about this generation, they will see right through you. If you work with young people long enough, you will know that. If you've got teenage kids, you will know that. The reality is people will listen to your preaching, but they will copy your practice. They'll hear your talk, but they'll mimic your walk. And, leadership is it's passing on what we carry. But what we carry is what we cultivate. So you passing on what you carry. And you think about the life of Mary, Jesus' mother. There was only one thing that she needed to be in order to carry the Son of God, and that was a virgin. God just had this one simple requirement of her life, not that she was this person of great words, but of great practice. And so, I actually think that it's really, really important for us as church to do this, because they will hear our preaching, and people will forever hear our preaching, but they will copy your practice, and you can't lead people beyond where you are. And you can't expect your church to be a church that's on fire for prayer if the pastor doesn't pray. Yeah. If the pastor isn't generous, if the pastor doesn't preach the gospel, you're trying to replicate something that's, well, you can only replicate something if you have something to replicate.
Exactly.
And so, Paul even said audaciously, follow me as I follow Christ. That is just like profound, that he was so confident in the way that he wasn't boasting in his life. He made that abundantly clear. But he was so confident in his Christian practice that he was like, well, just follow me. Like, watch what I'm doing and copy that. And so I don't think Paul said pray without ceasing and then said, by the way, I'm preaching to myself.
Yeah.
I think Paul said pray without ceasing, and then people watched his life and was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so I think it comes down to things like we need to move away from just having prayer meetings and have a prayer culture. They're two very, very different things.
Yeah.
We need to move away from having an offering to having a generous community.
Yeah.
And I think that as we start to push into that, we'll start to realize that authentic expression of the Christian faith, authentic expression of the Christian faith will win every time over the best public performance of the Christian faith. That is how our faith began. That is how the early church began. They didn't have the lights. They didn't have the smells and bells and the whistles. They had authentic Christian expression of love. And the reality is they did way more with way less.
Yeah.
And we right now, we have abundantly more than they could have ever thought or dreamed about. And we're doing exceptionally less than they did. And so, I think we have to sort of begin to allow the finger of God to point towards us. I think for a long time we've pointed our finger outwards towards the world.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, when we preach the gospel, we need to call out sin because sin separates us from God, and all that is important. But, Paul said to examine yourself to see if you're still within the faith. David prayed in Psalm 51, search me, oh God. What a terrifying prayer to pray. I think getting back to those places. And I think the problem is, to come to your question, it is just really scary.
Yeah.
It's really scary. And hey, it's scary for me to admit on a podcast what I did to that kid while he was listening to me preach the gospel.
Yeah.
It's scary for me to say that I became a professional Christian at one point. And even though I was ministering to thousands of people around the world, I wasn't very sure whether I knew God. But I think that vulnerability and authenticity, it permissions other people to be open about their issues and their problems. And don't get me wrong, we can't open our wounds to one another. We've got to let God heal them first.
Yeah.
So if you're in a place of wound, you need to spend that time in the secret place till it becomes a scar, because a scar is a sign that you've been healed, and we need to show people our scars. And it was Kirk Franklin who I love his music, and he said the problem in our generation is this generation's heard us preach the scriptures, but we've not shown them our scars. And I think that's important. We need to start being open about our brokenness. Paul said, I'll boast in my weakness. Matthew 5, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
We need to start opening ourselves up and saying, hey guys, this is where I struggled. And I think part of the problem is we've sort of said in the church that we've needed to have it all together. It's just the opposite of the gospel.
Yeah.
The gospel is none of us have got it together, and we desperately need Jesus. And I think the more that we can model radical dependency, throwing ourselves on the mercy of Jesus, we are literally creating a pathway for the next generation to do exactly the same.
Oh, that's beautiful. And it seems you're calling people to an integrated Christian life, that it's not just a Sunday, it's not just a prayer meeting, it's not just an offering, but it's all of life that we are seeking. We have this culture of prayer. We have a culture of following Jesus in everything. And so then if it is integrated and we are authentically following Jesus, and even in our struggles, we're admitting our struggles, we're vulnerable, we're weak. My question is, then you talked a little bit about like pray without ceasing. So what does it look like to have an integrated prayer life? And it's not just in the prayer room, but it spills out of the prayer room into the rest of your life, and we're praying without ceasing. How can we do that while we're in activity in the world and doing our work, our job, our family, and all the other things?
That's a really good question. For me, my prayer life was radically altered through the COVID season, as I've said before. And God gave me a bit of a PCR for prayer. So in the UK, you would have to take a PCR test to find out if you had COVID. I don't know if like that in the States as well. And so God gave me a PCR for prayer. And it was that prayer has to be persistent, consistent, and resistant. So persistent prayer comes from Luke 11:5-8, where Jesus tells this story of the man knocking on the door trying to get bread at midnight. And basically, Luke 11:8 says, the man didn't get up and rise to give him bread because of their friendship, but because of the persistence. Now, I found that so jarring because for most of my Christian life, I'd cruised in this car of, I am a friend of God. And I love that song. But the fact of the matter is, if we want to see a breakthrough in prayer, friendship with God is not enough. We have to persist in prayer. And actually the word in the Greek is anadia, which essentially means to be rude, which I kind of like. And you think about that friend knocking on the door at midnight and not stopping knocking until he gets the bread. That is quite rude.
Yeah.
And, Isaiah talks about it, doesn't it? Give God no rest. So, you think about, Elijah, he puts his head between his knees, like as if he's giving birth. You think about Daniel, who prayed 3 times a day. They sort of pushed beyond the boundaries of what was socially acceptable. And I think we live in a strange world where it's socially acceptable for a grown man to take his top off and swing it around his head at a football game and cry and jump around and shout. But if I'm in church, I have to stay quiet and I have to be, peaceful. And none of that stuff is wrong, but it's like we've quenched that fire that we're actually made to burn with. And so we need to persist in prayer. Consistent. My favorite quote on this whole consistent piece is that spiritual maturity is not the occasional practice of spectacular things. It's the consistent application of basic things. And I love that because we have sort of put on a platform and a pedestal all the spectacular parts of our faith. The great preaching, the great worship, the great music. But actually what God's really interested in is private devotion. Matthew 6:6, go into your room, shut the door, pray to your Father who sees in secret, and he'll reward you openly. That's what God's really after. And I think sometimes, when we jump in our car and we're tired and we're stressed and we're on the way to work and we think, I could pray and put some worship music on right now, but it's not very spectacular. I'm not really sure if God is so interested in my groans and my cry and my weeping but actually he couldn't be more interested. He's more interested in the consistent application of basic things than the occasional practice of spectacular things. You think about going to a conference, a 5-day conference, you feel closer to God on day 5 than you did on day 1. Why? Because you consistently came to the meetings and listened to the talks and engaged with the worship, and you felt closer to God. Why? Because you simply pushed yourself to get closer. And then resistant, of course, there are real spiritual dark forces in this world, and there's nothing that they resist more than prayer. Yeah. It's interesting in Matthew 4, Jesus goes to the wilderness to fast and pray, and the devil shows up. So he resists prayer. And I think he resists prayer because even the devil knows that private prayer brings public power.
Yeah.
And Jesus would go up the mountain to pray and come down the mountain and cast out demons. He'd go up the mountain to pray, come down the mountain and walk on water. And eventually by Luke 11, the disciples say, Lord, teach us how to pray. The only time in the Bible where the disciples asked Jesus to teach them how to do anything. I would have asked Jesus, teach me how to multiply the food. Yeah. Because the Chick-fil-A sandwich needs to go a bit further than what is happening right now. So the disciples realized that Jesus lived in this rhythm of prayer that brought a breakthrough. And so, as 24/7, we have an app called Lectio 365, which is available worldwide for free, which will help you pray day and night. Yeah, it's just simple acts of obedience like that will slowly bring you closer to God. And my friend James Ladderin says, desire without discipline dissipates. And so we, most of us, I hope, who call ourselves Christians have a desire for God. We love God, we're generous. We want to see his kingdom extended. But we need to start putting a bit of discipline onto that. Yeah. And what's interesting is as you press into discipline, your desire grows. So I started out, just praying for half an hour every day. I set my alarm half an hour early and just gave myself to pray for half an hour. And what began to happen was half an hour wasn't enough. Yeah. And I never thought that I could pray longer than half an hour. And so, it's just going on that journey with God and not putting this expectation on yourself that you're meant to be this big, spectacular, Stephen Furtick, amazing, although he is amazing, but I'm not him. I'm Josh Green, and God just wants to hear from me, and he wants my heart. And so we're coming back to that simplicity.
That's great. If you could, give a call to the youth of today, what would you want to call them to, and what would you want to say?
Yeah, I would say glean the gold from the generation above you. Don't write everything off. There's a reason why you know about Jesus, and it's because some old lady somewhere prayed and gave. And so I don't think this whole youth movement is meant to lead to not listening to the generation. The Bible talks about turning the hearts of the sons to the fathers and the fathers to the sons. And so we want this multi-generational move of God. So glean the gold from the older generation. Of course, this is the thing with this cancel culture. Alongside it, we have this expectation of perfection. So we expect the older generation to have been perfect. And the reality is, if you put yourself under that same expectation, you would crumble. And so we've got to glean the gold from the next generation, because there is gold there.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is, they were another generation that passed on the Christian faith, that stayed true, that built churches, that preached the gospel. And that is worth commending and worth listening to. And they're older than us. They're wiser than us. They know more than us. They've got a bit more life experience than us. And so it's just having that humility to glean the gold. And then what I would also say is, before I went to Asbury, there were kind of a number of things that I would say, in order to see revival, we're going to need a generation who's humble. We're going to need a generation that's holy. We're going to need a generation that's hungry, and we're going to need a generation that honors the next generation. And all those things are true. But if I could boil it down to one, I would say it's hunger. Because if you're humble, but you're not hungry, it's false humility. Because if it's not coming from a real place in you of wanting to be humble, then your humility is just a show for others.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually desire to be humble, it's the desire that God really cares about the most. So that is hunger. Same thing with holiness. If you're living holy without hunger, it's religion.
Yeah.
It's and the religion of the bad kind, like the Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
That the Pharisees, make no mistake about it, they lived a holy life, but not the holiness that God was looking for.
Yeah.
They didn't have holiness of the heart. They had holiness of the outward experience. And the same thing with honor. If you want to honor the Lord, honor people with, you do that with your life. And if there's no hunger behind your honor, then again, it's just lip service. And so I would just say to this next generation, do whatever you can to stay hungry for the Lord. If you go to all the prayer meetings, go to all the church services, look, fill your YouTube feed full of preaching and prayer and worship, and download the Spotify podcast, and do whatever it takes to stay hungry. Because there's nothing that the devil fights more than hunger for God.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what
awesome. That's really good, Josh. That's really good. That's really helpful for us to actually see that all of the outward expressions of things actually requires a desire and a hunger from us to move forward, and God will actually honor that in the midst. Just like the parable he talked about of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the tax collector basically bowing his head said, "Have mercy on me, a sinner," and that he's the one who went home honored before God and exalted because it was true humility. And not saying, "Hey, look at all the holiness things that I've done, and I'm better than everybody else." So that's perfect. That's wonderful. A couple quick questions. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh dear. I do not want to go back to my 21-year-old self, because I wasn't married to my lovely wife, which she would give me bonus points for saying that. If I could go back to my 21-year-old self, I would tell myself to read Luke 11:5-8, and read it over and over again until you get the message of what Jesus is trying to say. Because that's the persistent prayer thing. And I've realized that pretty much every single breakthrough that I've had with God in my life has come off the back of someone else or myself humbly and persistently giving myself to God in prayer. And I see that breakthrough. And so That would be one thing. The other thing would be, you've got to crucify the trying to please man thing in you. It's just such a hard one to deal with this in this generation where you have to be online and you have to be doing this and it's just all built to have this thing before people rather than having a heart before God. That's why God chose David, because he was a shepherd boy in the field who had a heart after God. He's a man after my own heart. And so, I would just tell myself to read Luke 11:5-8 and say, do it as much in the secret place as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Oh, well, I've been watching The Chosen.
Yes.
I absolutely love The Chosen. I'm sure that there is some controversy around it somewhere, as seems to be with anything that is of any note at all. But it's really blessed me. I've also been reading, I mainly read from the New King James Version in the Bible, but I have actually at times gone over to the Message translation, and sometimes I just find that the way that Eugene Peterson puts words to certain things, it just, some people think it's just a paraphrase or whatever, but it just brings a new life to the verses. And I think, stay with your ESV or whatever it is. But I just think sometimes just having that extra perspective on it really, really helps. And I'm sure that there must be a book. Oh yes, there is a book by a guy called David Thomas. He's from Kentucky. He's one of the professors over at Asbury. And the book is called To Sow for a Great Awakening. And it's about travailing prayer. And it's a short book, about 35 pages. It'll take about 25 minutes to read. It's a free resource that is on Seedbed, which you can look up online. The book is by David Thomas, Sow for a Great Awakening. And it changed my prayer life, that book. So
awesome. Love it. How can people connect in with you or 24/7 prayer? What you guys are doing?
So you can find out about the 24/7 prayer movement at 24-7.com, 247prayer.com. So what do you call a dash in America? Like just a little line?
I call it a dash.
A dash. So
so that's what we call it. We call it a dash.
Sometimes you don't know, because we say aluminium and you guys say aluminum, so it can be difficult sometimes. So it's 24-7prayer.com. There you'll find resources to get young people to pray on there. You'll find resources to help your church pray. You can learn how to set up a 24/7 prayer room. You can find out more about Lectio, and Pete Gregg's books are all on there. So that would be great. If you want to find more about 24/7 Prayer Youth and everything we're doing for young people, you can follow us on Instagram at 24/7 Prayer Youth. And we've got a lot more coming out, so check us out online.
Great. Well, Josh, it was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you for walking us through what's happening with the youth and new revival and bubbles of revival that's happening because of the hunger that young people have for Jesus and Jesus alone, that brings in the authenticity, the vulnerability of who we actually are in the face of God, that we are called to be people that are humble and saying that he is the one who's worth it, that we could start to orient ourselves not around celebrities, but around Jesus himself, that we could start to persist in prayer and what that looks like. And so it was a great conversation. I loved it. And I think we got a lot out of it. And so now we get to start to persist and commit to our prayers, to have consistent prayers, to resist the devil and what we're doing. And if we're doing that, I think that this world is going to look a lot different. And we're going to actually see the justice and the shalom of the city and the communities around us happen. So thank you so much for this conversation. It was great. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.